Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ambika Trasi, pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm a curatorial assistant at the Whitney Museum. I'm happy to share that tonight's event is being live captioned in English. If you would like to enable this feature, click the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen or on the three dots also at the bottom of your screen. Thank you to Morgan Pate and Sign Nexus for the live captioning. I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Munsee Lenape, and I encourage everyone to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous lands from where you are tuning in tonight. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's edition of Ask a Curator. The Ask a Curator programs offer you a chance to hear from the Whitney curators about their experience curating their exhibitions and allow you to ask your own questions about the artists, and ideas behind the shows. It is my great delight to introduce tonight's speaker, Assistant Curator Elisabeth Sherman. She will be giving you an inside look at Dawoud Bey, an American project, which opened in April and is on view through October 3rd. The exhibition was curated by Elisabeth Sherman and Corey Keller at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where it was originally presented, traveling on to Atlanta's High Museum before its presentation here in New York. Spanning 2 floors of the Whitney Museum, the lobby gallery and the 8th floor, the exhibition features over 4 decades of Dawoud Bey's work. I had the honor of working as a curatorial assistant on the show with Elisabeth over this past year, so I'm looking forward to learning even more about her process and her time working with Dawoud on this important and powerful exhibition. I will return later to moderate the Q&A portion of the program. If you would like to submit a question, please do so using the Q&A feature in Zoom. Click on the icon at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. Please feel free to submit your questions during the talk, and I'll be selecting a handful of those to pose to Elisabeth. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and now I'll hand it over to Elisabeth Sherman.
Thank you so much, Ambika, and I just want to acknowledge all of the hard work that Ambika did on this exhibition and its presentation at the Whitney. She's been a fantastic partner, and I look forward to speaking with you at the end of this presentation and answering everyone's questions. And welcome everybody, wherever you are Zooming in from tonight. I'm so glad that you could join us, and I hope that this is a helpful introduction to the show, whether or not you're able to see it in person. I certainly hope that those of you in New York are able to, but if not, I do hope that you get a sense of the experience on site through the screen today. So I'm going to start just by reading a very short introduction, but I do hope that this feels a little casual today and conversational. So Dawoud Bey was born in 1953 in Queens here in New York. And for the last 40 years, he has worked to expand upon what photography can and should be. He insists that photography is an ethical practice requiring collaboration with his subjects. He creates poignant meditations on visibility, power, and race. Dawoud chronicles communities and histories that have been largely underrepresented or even unseen. And his work lends renewed urgency to an enduring conversation about what it means to represent America with a camera. And one of the things I'd like to say about that to start is that something that's really important to Dawoud, and I hope to adhere to that as much tonight in this program as possible, is that Dawoud really asks that when we speak about his photographic practice, and in fact, I think this should be something we're all mindful of when we speak about photography in general, is that rather than using words like taking a picture, shooting a picture, words that have these kind of violent and exploitative connotations, that we actually talk about making a picture, documenting a subject, words that are more generous, more collaborative. So I thought that those are kind of important framing points to start the conversation. Dawoud began making pictures at a young age. Like many people of his generation, he was given a Brownie camera as a young person by a family member. But early in his life, music was his first artistic love. He was a drummer, and that's really where he found his expression. But Dawoud's journey as a photographer, his kind of personal narrative really begins where the exhibition begins, with a first body of work that, should you be on site at the Whitney, you would see on this intro wall on the 8th floor. The body of work is called Harlem, USA. Here's a close-up shot of those works installed on the wall. And Dawoud's story about how he began to make this body of work has become somewhat legendary. He talks about, there was this kind of infamous, very controversial show at the Met in the 70s called Harlem on My Mind. And Dawoud had heard about the show and heard about the protests that were being led outside of the show because of its lack of inclusion of many Black artists, despite the fact that it was purporting to represent a neighborhood of Black cultural production. So he went to the Met one day and wanted to join the protests and sort of check out what was happening there. But the day that he arrived, there actually were no protests. So in his telling, he decided, well, if there are no protests, I might as well go in and see the show. And when he arrived, his experience of the exhibition was actually a profound one, because what he encountered there were images representing people that looked like him, people who looked like members of his community on the walls of this, supposedly hallowed institution of fine art. And he had never seen anything like that before, and not really expected to. And there he was introduced to the work of photographers like Gordon Parks and James Van Der Zee. And this is really, as he tells it, his origin story and his beginning of his love and passion for photography. So he started making these pictures in Harlem in 1975. And his interest in this body of work was to look at this community where he had spent a lot of time as a young person. His parents had met in Harlem. Many of his family members lived there. It was a real place to him, a living, breathing, dynamic place. But it's also a place that was then and still is in so many ways a sort of stand-in for lots of Black cultural production. Of course, the Harlem Renaissance, many artists have come out of this neighborhood. And so he wanted to look at the place both for its kind of mythology as well as its reality, and represent the members of that community in all of their complexity and individuality. So he spent a lot of time photographing on the streets. And it was important to him from the beginning of his practice that he made pictures of people with their consent and knowledge. The tradition of street photography has often included practices which are fascinating, interesting, and great practices, but where the photographer is taking pictures without the knowledge of the subject in the photographs. And from the beginning, this was not a way that Dawoud wanted to approach his artistic form. So he specifically talks about this photograph that you see on the left here, a man in a bowler hat, as kind of a decisive moment for him in his career. He was walking down the street and saw this man standing with a group of friends, and the way that the man was dressed was really kind of out of time or timeless. He could be in any moment. He could be in the 1920s, he could be in the 1940s. And in some ways, it was a little bit anachronistic in 1976 for him to be dressed this way. So he kind of passed by, thought he wanted to make an image of this man, and got to the end of the block and hadn't said anything, and I think felt a little afraid, and then realized that if he didn't turn around and ask to take this man's picture, he might not be able to do what he was trying to do with his life. So he did it. Obviously, he took this wonderful picture, and the rest is sort of history. From the beginning of Dawoud's work, something else that was very important to him was to show a body of work in the neighborhood in which he made it for its first exhibition. And so he was able to show this series, Harlem, USA, at the Studio of Museum in Harlem in the 70s before it was shown anywhere else. And that practice continues to this day. When you're in the exhibition, the outside walls of the show, which we unfortunately don't have installation shots to share with you today of, but what you really first approach before you see Harlem, USA is Dawoud's return to the neighborhood in 2016 with a project called Harlem REDUX. And his interest in these works, which are much larger in scale than the small, intimate, black and white Harlem, USA photographs, was to look back at this neighborhood that had, in the ensuing decades since he first documented it, undergone radical transformations. And those transformations were really because of rapid gentrification and the forces of capitalism. So these are pictures that for some people, I think, are a little bit unusual in Dawoud's practice, in that he is really known for his portraits, but all along throughout his work, as we see in Harlem, USA, and again in Harlem Redux, he's always negotiating the subject and the place in which the subject is photographed. And so in these works, there are people in every image. Sometimes they're a little bit harder to find, but the the neighborhood kind of becomes the primary subject, and these forces that it has undergone, and the changes that have taken place there. And when you see them at the Whitney, we've put them on these outside walls, both so that you get a sense of Dawoud's ongoing engagement with the past and the present in all of his work. So you see his recent work in the neighborhood, and then you kind of go back to the beginning. But also to acknowledge that when you visit a museum, you're not visiting a blank space, you're visiting a space that also has its own history. You have arrived from a specific neighborhood. You are viewing these works in a specific place. And so by placing these works on the outside walls near the windows of the Whitney, I was hoping to also acknowledge that the Meatpacking District, while a neighborhood with a very different history than Harlem, is also one that has undergone the rapid forces of gentrification. The Whitney is certainly a part of that. And so to kind of connect these histories to the place that you're viewing the works in. So after this introduction, you round the corner and you come onto the next body of work in the sort of loose chronology that we are presenting them in the exhibition. And this is a body of work made in Syracuse, New York. I didn't mention that with Harlem, USA, Dawoud was working with a 35mm camera with a wide angle lens on the camera. And it's a really small camera. It has this ability to have the figure really at the foreground of the picture plane while capturing a sense of the landscape behind them. But it's also an easy camera to carry around to make really casual street pictures. Dawoud doesn't use the camera as casually as many practitioners of the medium do, but it's very discreet. And something else that he reminded me of when we were installing these works in this grid in this way is that 35mm cameras take a roll of film with 36 images in it. And so those of you who remember real film will remember that sense of having a roll of film and the accumulation of a narrative over the course of the film. And so installing the works in this tight grid was to kind of remind the viewer of the process and the origin of the work. In this body of work, he was invited to do a residency with Lightworks in Syracuse, and he wanted to focus there on the Black community in Syracuse and really get to know it. And just like he had done in Harlem, kind of show the complexities and all the nuance and beauty of this neighborhood and these people's lives. Here, he's starting to really look at references like the artist Roy de Carava and think about using light and shadow in a much more angular and specific way than he was doing in the Harlem, USA works. But after this body of work with Syracuse, Dawoud makes a kind of dramatic shift in the way that he is working with his subjects and working with the camera. And he switches from the 35mm camera to a 4x5 camera, which is a much larger camera. It's on a tripod. It requires a longer exposure. And so rather than being kind of discreet in making these works in the street, he really had to engage more deeply with his subject, have a longer engagement with them. And his process of making the photograph couldn't be, it was noticed. It was something he was doing in the street in a very obvious way. He also had the opportunity to work with a kind of film called Type 55 positive negative Polaroid film. And this is a film where I think, many of us are familiar with the kind of Polaroid film with the small camera and the little picture comes out the end, and that's the image that you have. But this film is a much larger film. And in addition to the positive print that was produced immediately after the image was taken, it also produced a negative. So Dawoud was really interested in working with this film because in increasingly thinking about the ethics of making a picture, he wanted to collaborate with his subjects as much as possible and have the relationship be as reciprocal as possible. So while he might have been taking something, he might have been making this negative that he could take back to his studio and produce a body of work with, he wanted to give something to the subjects as well. And so after he made their portraits, they would get the positive that was produced immediately uh, at that moment, and then he would take the negative and print them later. He's also been able to return to this body of work, and I'll quickly go back to the installation shot so you can see, um, and print these images much, much larger, which was his original intention, but at the time, when he was making these works in the late 80s and early 90s, it wasn't possible technologically. And at this much larger scale, when you're in the gallery, you're really looking at a kind of life-size figure. I think it's important to remember, as much as we're all really used to seeing things on the screen this year, and this is a wonderful way to experience a show if you can't get to it. These are objects. These are not just kind of digital representations. And so the scale, the materiality, and all of these choices that go into his process are really part of the intention behind the work. And so for the viewer to encounter these individuals and sort of have to have this direct engagement with them one-to-one is really at the core of this body of work, the street portraits. I should put a plug in here if this is work you want to know more about. He just released a book called Street Portraits of this entire series. It's a beautiful new book, and you can get it many places, including our bookstore. From the street portraits, he continued to work with Polaroid film, and for the first time really started making images in a studio off the street where the subjects are not in a particular place, and they are really kind of the main focus of the work. These unique color Polaroids were made with a very, very different kind of camera and film than he had been working with before. The camera is called a 20 by 24 Polaroid camera, and it is over 300 pounds. It is has these incredibly long bellows, and it's operated with the photographer sitting behind the lens. And then at the other end of the bellows is a technician who is adjusting the front of it to focus the image, and they have to really work in tandem. It takes a long time to make a picture. It has to be done in this very controlled studio setting. So Dawoud started making these unique images in singles and then in doubles, where he would take multiple make multiple images of the same person. Here we see the artist Lorna Simpson. He started really making images of his friends and family when he was working with this camera. But then over time, as the series evolved, he started to think about the idea that there is never one image that can fully represent an individual. This feels somewhat obvious, but also I think is so worth the reminder, and at the core of this body of work, that every time there's a picture made, it's a snapshot of a moment, of an angle, of a way that light is hitting a person, and not really getting at their full depth and complexity of self. And so by fracturing and multiplying these images, here I should also point out this is the artist Kerry James Marshall and his wife Cheryl, who's an actress. In this fracturing and doubling and duplicating, he could really start to point at the complexity of making an image of an individual. As the series continued, and in these last couple that I've showed on the screen, he moved beyond his circle of friends and family and started to work with teenagers. And teenagers at this point would become a really great subject for him that he would focus on for about 10 years in a body of work called Class Pictures. So in the exhibition, you move into this kind of central gallery where you see these works from Class Pictures on the outsides of the wall. These bodies of work were made over a series of residencies. They started at the Andover Gallery the Addison Gallery at Andover. And he would be invited by different museums to do these residencies, and the museums would help him to reach out to local schools. And he specifically wanted to work with schools across socioeconomic lines. So private schools, public schools, schools that drew from all different kinds of demographics, and to work collaboratively with the students to make images of themselves. So he would invite the students into the classrooms. They would come dressed as they wanted to be dressed, pose themselves as they wanted to be posed. And as part of the project, they would also write these statements. It was an open invitation to kind of say as much as they wanted about any subject they wanted. And it really captures this moment in time where these, individuals, teenagers that we don't often really look at. I think teenagers in so many ways are the focus of so much of our popular cultural production, yet we so rarely actually look at teenagers because they're in this state betwixt and between childhood and adulthood. They feel awkward about it. We as adults feel awkward about it. And this is really why Dawoud wanted to think about this population. As part of this project, there would, in addition to the collaboration of making of the images and writing of the texts, there would often also be a collaborative exhibition component where the hosting institution would work with Dawoud and the students to mount an exhibition from their permanent collection. And so it was a way of him continuing his engagement with the subjects of this work. I realize that I'm scrolling past these somewhat quickly, and so you might not be able to read them all, but I hope you've gotten a sense of the variety of voices and their perspectives. So in the exhibition, you then move into the final gallery on the 8th floor, which is Dawoud's most recent work, and is a body of work called Night Coming Tenderly Black. Chronologically, this work comes after the Harlem REDUX work, so you can see how he's thinking more and engaging more deeply with the landscape. But Dawoud is constantly reminding people when they say, this is such a break in your work, there are no figures, how did you get here? That actually at the core of this work is the figure, and the absent figure is really what the subject of this work is about. So the work is made after a long time that Dawoud spent researching the last leg of the Underground Railroad as it's made its way in Ohio towards the Lake Erie and Canada. And so the fugitive enslaved people who were traveling on the Underground Railroad, once they crossed Lake Erie and made it into Canada, they would have arrived at freedom. And in researching this area and this leg of the Underground Railroad, what Dawoud found was that kind of necessarily there's an absence in the archive, that most of the places, the sites, the homes that were the stops on the Underground Railroad are not documented. And that's not just because of the biases of the people who built these archives, but it was also a necessary function of the Underground Railroad to remain secretive. So in order to kind of reconstruct this lost history and really show how the past is ever present in our daily lives, how the past and these histories are what dictate the conditions that we are all living in, which is really so much of the thrust of Dawoud's work. He needed to kind of imagine these landscapes. And so he talks about these landscapes as being ones of imagined fugitivity, where we as the viewer are kind of imagining what it would be like to move through these landscapes in a fugitive way, to be an enslaved person and be, fighting for our own freedom. The work has really two main inspirations. The first is Roy DeCarava, who I've mentioned already. And DeCarava, in addition to being known for light and shadow, is really known for the blackness in his photographs, for the way in which he embraced the kind of lush, velvety tones that a gelatin silver print can accomplish. On our screen today, I think these look a lot lighter than they do in person. They're actually really, really deep, dark prints. And they require some time. They require some time for your eyes to adjust, for your body to move around, to take them all in. And that's part of the experience. And then the title of the work comes from the final couplet of a Langston Hughes poem, where he writes, "Night coming tenderly, black like me." And Dawoud was really thinking about the way Hughes and de Carava sort of talk about the lush, protective quality of Blackness. And that was something he wanted to embrace in the concept of this work. So after you finish on the 8th floor, hopefully, if you are in the building, you go down to the lobby gallery. Apologies for this. All of our installation shots have not been finished yet, so some of them are better than others. But when you go down to the lobby gallery, you encounter a body of work called the Birmingham Project, which is the work that Dawoud made just before Night Coming Tenderly Black. And he thinks of these two projects as his history projects, where he's really thinking about, as I was saying, the ways in which these moments or these events or these periods of American history are never past us. They are really defining, again, as I said, the conditions of contemporary life. So the Birmingham Project came out of spending about 7 years in Birmingham, wanting to work with the Birmingham Museum and that community there, and getting to know the residents who live there now, what Birmingham is like today, and approaching the 50th anniversary of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, this horrific event in the civil rights movement, where it's well known that 4 young girls were murdered in the bombing of the church on a September Sunday morning. What Dawoud found in his research was that there were 2 young boys who were also murdered that day in the violent aftermath after the bombing. And so he wanted to pay tribute to and honor these lives lost, and really to make the viewers of his work understand, it's very easy when we talk about these historical moments to kind of gloss over the enormity of what is lost when an individual life is lost. We wind up talking in numbers, and it can be easy to forget names. And so the work that Dawoud made for this project are these diptych photographs where he found residents of Birmingham who were either, in the case of the younger people represented in these pictures, the age of one of the children who was murdered on that day, or in the case of the older people in the images, the age that those children would have been had they not been murdered and they had lived all the ensuing 50 years. And so it's really that space between these two portraits where we can see and understand and hopefully feel really viscerally what is lost, what is stolen when life is taken away. Accompanying these pictures is a 2-channel video called 9/15/63, the date of the church bombing. And the video, it has 2 channels. On the left-hand side are these, there's no words. It's a beautiful soundtrack that actually his son, who works in music, produced for him. And on the left-hand side, you see these very slow panning shots of everyday places in Birmingham, places that might be very familiar, especially to Black residents of Birmingham today, but also places that would have been very politically charged during the civil rights movement. So here in this still, you see in particular a classroom, there's a lunch counter, a barber shop, and sites like that. And then on the right-hand side, you're seeing the final image from the video. But the right-hand side shows the camera kind of looking up at an angle and traces the pathway from one of the little girls' homes to the church, and gives you the perspective of sitting in the back seat of your parents' car, looking out of the window on a sunny September Sunday morning on your way to church. So this body of work in the lobby gallery by itself is really meant to be a kind of space for contemplation, for really engaging with the subject matter that Dawoud is presenting in this work. So that is my brief introduction to Dawoud and his show. I should mention we made a catalog with the exhibition, which is called 2 American Projects, because it documents the Birmingham Project and Night Coming Tenderly Black, and has some excellent essays in it. So if you want to check it out, I think we're very proud of the book we made. So with that, I think I should welcome Ambika back. Hi, Ambika.
Hi. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's so nice to hear you could run through sort of walk us through the exhibition, even though I've had the experience of being part of this and being in the space. It's a really lovely reminder of all of Dawoud's influences and everything that has gone into creating his various series. For me personally, I started working on this exhibition with you when we started our working from home about a year ago. And so for me, one of the most exciting parts of working on this was being in our meetings with our colleagues in exhibitions and exhibition design. It felt like a highlight given given our time of social distancing, and even though it was quite unusual because we weren't working together in the way that we usually would by like looking at a model and maquettes in a space together. I think it would be great to maybe talk about that and give some insight to our audience of what that process was like.
Absolutely. Well, it was a real treat for me to work with you too in that way, and all of our colleagues. Increasingly over the last number of years, we at the Whitney have been working both in models, as you said, as you know, and on site, but also working digitally. And so I think there's no fortunate in the last year, but fortunately we had been, and in fact, the show you and I worked on together before this, Making Knowing, we had done a lot of kind of digital renderings and mapping things out that way in advance. And so this was kind of a remarkable process in all joining together on Zoom with our exhibition designers, pulling up the floor plans of the show, and often in real time on the computer, moving around the little images, and their capabilities of rendering what the floor would feel like in advance actually made this one of the smoothest installations I've ever done, because I think we were so well planned in advance. We didn't leave a lot to chance. And I think it will be really interesting to see on the other side of this moment what from working this way we keep, because it has been so transformative of our process.
Agree. And there were a few questions about Dawoud's relationship to his subjects, both those who are actually sitting for him, and also those that he's like his subjects and his street photography, and the kind of psychological safety that he is providing for them. The line between how discretion and also permission, and I'm wondering if you could speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hope that this answers the question or some of the questions. And so Ambika, tell me if I'm not quite hitting it, but someone was saying to me recently, and I hope that I'm not repeating like an incorrect lore, but we were talking about Richard Avedon, who's another very famous photographer, very well known for making portraits. And Avedon is one of Dawoud's influences, someone whose work he really thinks about. But the person I was talking to was saying that whenever you look at an Avedon, you don't see the person that he is making a picture of, you see Richard Avedon. And that was who he was as a person, and that was kind of who his work was. But that in contrast, whenever you look at a photograph of Dawoud Bey's, you see the person that he's making the image of, because Dawoud's intention, and I imagine I've never been photographed by him, but what comes across in the images to me and in the ways that he talks about making the images and working with his subjects is that his entire intention is to give space for that individual, to make a place for that individual to be seen, and to be seen on the walls of these spaces that still don't represent these subjects, particularly Black subjects, as often as they should. And so I think that ethic and that care and that intention probably permeate the experience of being photographed by him, but also profoundly come across in seeing the images, and really profoundly come across in seeing the images in person. There's just a very different experience when you're standing in the galleries in front of these works. You feel like you're with somebody. It's kind of remarkable.
Be related to that, I think there were a couple questions about the selection of Polaroids that ended up in the Whitney's presentation, and the Polaroids selections were different across each presentation, from SF MoMA to the High to the Whitney, and I'm wondering what went into the selection of those works. I was so moved, as I think, especially given the personal relationships that we see in the Whitney selection when we walked Dawoud through the exhibition shortly after it opened to see his son looking at his family portrait. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's important to point out, and I meant to say it when I was talking about that body of work, is that color Polaroid prints are one of the most fugitive, fleeting, fragile kinds of artworks of all. They are of photography in particular, but of all kinds of works of art. So they require really low lighting, because light is ultimately the enemy of all works of art. Light fades them. And so unlike the rest of the works in the show, which are editions, so there's a number of prints of each that exist, these are unique works and cannot really handle being on view for as long as this tour is. So each venue has kind of selected their own works. Partially I wanted to pick some artists who had these Whitney relationships. I thought it was like really great to get Lorna Simpson and Carrie James Marshall on the walls. I really did. We weren't able to show it today, but there's a 3-part image. It's a family portrait of his former wife and his son when his son was an infant, and his wife's parents, that came from her home. It's been on the walls of her home all these years. And so that sense, Dawoud is an artist and a person whose community is centrally important to him. And that community extends beyond photographers and beyond visual artists, to musicians, to all kinds of thinkers. And so I wanted a moment where we could kind of pull in that sense of community. And then the kind of other half is that we happen to have a great selection of these works in our collection, some of which we've purchased and some of which have been given to us as gifts over the years. And so it was a great chance to put the Whitney's own works on view.
And Dawoud has also spoken about this presentation, the Whitney's, being almost like a homecoming for him, just given his relationship with the city, because he photographed so much of the work in New York. I wonder how that played into your decisions while curating the show, and how important that was. I think the placement of Dawoud's Harlem REDUX series from 2014 to 2016, near his earliest series, Harlem, U.S.A, felt really particularly affecting when you're entering the show.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I'd say the way that it affected my thinking was that it felt like a lot of pressure, because I knew, what I didn't get a chance to say was that Dawoud was born and raised here and obviously made so much of his work here, but has spent the last couple of decades in Chicago. He's a teacher, continues to be a practicing teacher of photography at Columbia College in Chicago. So he's kind of a son of two cities. I think both cities kind of claim him as theirs, and he claims both cities. So it did feel like there was a lot of pressure, that the context here was very different and specific in a different way from San Francisco and Atlanta, and it will go on to Houston after this. So, and also just the pressure of knowing that so many of his friends and families live here and would see it and would come. You always want to do the best job you can, but that certainly added a layer of it. But yes, as you say, starting the show with the 2 Harlem bodies of work, I think that decision was really made with the specificity of New York in mind, the specificity of that history in mind. Dawoud also is constantly reminding me that Harlem Redux has never been shown in New York as a body of work before, despite being made here. So really starting with that body of work about this city that hasn't had a chance to be shown in the city felt important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the placement of Harlem Redux also along the windows seems another reminder of that. I would love to also to speak a little bit about the lobby gallery. You and I have both had the pleasure of curating in that space a few times before. And it strikes me every time I see a new show in there just how versatile of a space it is. I feel like it just feels transformed each time. And you've created such a poignant, almost spiritual like atmosphere in that space for the Birmingham project. And that feels really necessary for that work. And you have also, in doing so, have kept it separate from the rest of the exhibition. I would love to hear you speak about the process of what went into that decision. And
yeah, well, I should acknowledge for all of you who may not know, if you joined one of our prior Ask a Curators, Ambika was the curator being asked because the prior show in the lobby gallery was her fantastic Salmontour exhibition. And if you saw that and see this, you will see how flexible and malleable that space is, because we actually had the exact same architecture, the same intro wall, but for that show, the walls were painted this kind of really wonderful sort of pale pink.
yeah.
And, you know, I think I'll get to the decision of Birmingham by itself and in that space, but I think one of the decisions that really came to define the feeling of this exhibition is this wall color, this sort of deep, deep gray that we chose, and just instantly painting that room out in that color changes the sense of space, changes the mood, changes the way the photographs read off of the wall. And so that decision, I think, was really central to kind of making that atmosphere in there. But one thing I am always really cognizant of when curating in the lobby gallery is that it is our free space, that the rest of the museum requires an admission ticket, but that anybody who comes and wants to walk into the lobby is welcome to visit the lobby gallery without a ticket. And so thinking about that and thinking not only what could be this standalone experience, but kind of what would be an important standalone experience for any visitors who wanted to access the show in that way. And also what body of work could kind of be removed from the 8th floor while keeping a coherent narrative on the 8th floor, and also standalone sort of as its own exhibition. So they work together, they work separately. And then finally, and as you said, and as I think I said when I was talking about that body of work, it just is a body of work that requires a certain reverence. It's a Night Coming Tenderly Black certainly does as well. But this is really a body of work about 6 lives that were taken. And so wanting to create a space for people to acknowledge that, to experience any feelings they might have upon thinking about that, and really just work with the work that is doing the job of honoring those lives.
Yeah. There are a couple questions about other artists Dawoud has been influenced by. I know you had mentioned a couple. I'd love to hear more. I know there was another question about whether he was influenced by the Camoinge group, and he was indeed. Just one, it's nice to see the show following our Camoinge exhibition. I'd like to speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a whole I think the important preface is that, as I said, Dawoud has been a teacher of photography for many decades. He is a scholar of photography. And so his references are kind of limitless in many ways. But, you know, he thinks a lot about classic American photography. So I've mentioned artists like Gordon Parks and James Van Der Zee. Ansel Adams, Walker Evans. I mentioned Avedon, Roy de Carava, very, very central. So those are some of the photographers that he thinks about. But he's also been in deep dialogue with many painters over many years, some of whom, again, are depicted in the exhibition. The painter Turquoise Dyson is somebody who he currently is having a lot of dialogue about abstraction and Blackness as a color, Blackness as a subject. As I said, music is deeply important to him. John Coltrane, Herbie Hancock, more contemporary artists like Esperanza Spalding and Andra Day. I'm just listing people that Dawoud tells me about. In fact, he has this great catalog that came out the year before we started working on this show called Seeing Deeply. And in the back of the catalog is this kind of whole chronology. And by reading the chronology, you get a sense of all the people he's crossed paths with, all the art that he's loved. He actually has a lot of work, I think from the 90s, that are not really kind of part of his artistic practice, but where he took portraits of artists in his community that he was friends with. And then he sort of, in addition to the Kamoinge reference and the show that we had on the 8th floor just before Dawoud's, he also documented David Hammond's, many of his sort of street artworks, a very famous work called Blizzard Ball and one called Pissed Off. And we showed these photographs in a show we had earlier this fall on the occasion of our new Hammond's Days End sculpture public project that's actually just been completed on the pier. So the influences and the references are myriad and wide ranging, and I think some that you can find aesthetically in the work and some that are kind of more conceptual adjacencies.
Great. Get into one last question because I'm realizing I'm looking at the time right now. But before I do, I wanted to shout out an event that we have next Wednesday, May 12th at 6 p.m. that the Whitney is hosting, Reimagining History, Dawoud Bey in conversation with Jason Moran and Sarah Broom. So related to your, what you were just saying.
This program, if you haven't had enough about Dawoud tonight, please join us next week. Jason Moran is this incredible jazz musician, accolades galore if you haven't heard of him. And then Sarah Broom is an author who wrote this book that is sort of part memoir, part history, called The Yellow House, about her family house in New Orleans. That is just a stunning book. It really kind of breaks all the forms of nonfiction and creates something totally new. And so please join us for that.
Yeah. There was just a nice personal question of like, what emotional connections did you feel towards Dawoud Bey's work, and even what your experience was like just working with him over the course of this show? We could end there after.
That's so nice. Well, I had the wonderful opportunity when I was a curatorial assistant of assisting on the 2014 Whitney Biennial. And I did not go into Dawoud's long history with the institution, but he was included in that biennial by the curator, Michelle Grabner, and she included a few of the works from the Birmingham series, as well as one of his works that he does not consider a work of art, but he actually took then candidate Barack Obama's portrait. I believe it was when he was a candidate, his official portrait when he was running for president. And so that portrait hung in the entrance to the 4th floor in the Whitney's old Breuer building. So I had this opportunity to kind of work in a way with Dawoud on that show and get to know his work. And then I also work closely with our photography collection and our photography acquisitions committee. And so have kind of known and watched and cared for his work over the years. So it was a really wonderful opportunity. And he is just a delightful person to work with. Such a generous, as I said, it comes across in the work, but so generous, such a wonderful teacher, but also somebody who really, he's said to me he feels like he makes the work, and then it's the curator's turn to do their job. And so he made it very easy.
Okay. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We hope to see you all on Zoom next week. The link to join that program was posted by Joel in the chat. Take care. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elisabeth. This was so wonderful to hear from you.
Bye.
Bye.